Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It starts with an unbelievable proposal. Stay tuned, because things are about to get even more complicated for Mark, and this decision may just change his life in ways he never expected. Don't miss the next part of the story. Mark spent the next few days torn between his pride and his desperation. He couldn't stop thinking about Eleanor's proposal. It was an offer too good to refuse, but too bizarre to accept. His life had always been about survival, and this felt like something out of a movie. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he might never get another chance to escape his mounting debt and family obligations. That evening, as the rain pounded against the windows of his small apartment, Mark sat at his kitchen table, a mug of cold coffee in front of him. The weight of the decision pressed down on him. He looked at his phone, the same number from Eleanor Brooks staring back at him. He had promised himself that he would never compromise his dignity. But dignity wouldn't pay for his mother's medical bills. Dignity wouldn't pay for his sister's education. And dignity certainly wouldn't take care of the house that was slowly slipping from his grasp. With a heavy sigh, Mark dialed Eleanor's number. As the conversation ended, Mark's heart sank. He had agreed to marry a woman he barely knew, not out of love, but out of sheer necessity. And deep down, he wondered if he would ever truly be able to see her as anything more than just a business partner. The next evening, Mark arrived at the grand, imposing estate of Eleanor Brooks. The mansion stood at the end of a long driveway, its windows gleaming with soft light against the dark sky. He had never been inside a place like this before, and he felt out of place as he walked up the marble steps to the front door. Eleanor greeted him with a smile that was both warm and businesslike. "Mark, I'm glad you're here," she said as she led him into the luxurious foyer. The house was decorated with fine art, crystal chandeliers, and plush furnishings. Every detail screamed wealth, and Mark couldn't help but feel like a fish out of water. They sat at a long dining table, where Eleanor explained the specifics of the agreement. It wasn't just about living together or attending events. The contract was clear. Mark would pose as her husband in public, attend charity galas, and be by her side in any business dealings. In return, she would pay off his debts, cover his family's expenses, and provide a comfortable life for him. Later that night, after Mark had signed the papers, Eleanor invited him to stay for dinner. As they ate, the conversation shifted from business to something more personal. Eleanor shared her own struggles, her past, and why she had chosen to live such a solitary life. She was a woman used to control, but she admitted that she longed for a companion, someone she could trust. Mark listened, intrigued by the vulnerability she showed. She wasn't the cold, calculating woman he had imagined. There was more to her than just business. But despite the connection they were beginning to form, Mark reminded himself that this was still a business arrangement. They were not partners in love, they were partners in survival. As the evening ended, Mark felt a strange sense of uncertainty. He had agreed to the deal, but now that he was here, in her world, he wondered if this decision would truly solve all his problems, or if it would only bring more complications. Eleanor escorted him to the guest room, where he would stay for the night. As he lay in the large, comfortable bed, Mark stared at the ceiling, wondering what tomorrow would bring. He had made his choice. There was no turning back. Tomorrow, their new lives would begin. But Mark knew, deep down, that the line between fake and real would blur more quickly than he expected. Stay tuned for the next chapter, where Mark's world starts to shift in unexpected ways. The next morning, Mark awoke in the grand guest room, the sunlight streaming through the tall windows and casting a soft glow on the elegant furniture. For a moment, he forgot where he was. The soft luxury of the room felt like a distant dream compared to the cramped apartment he had left behind. He sat up slowly, the weight of the previous night's decision settling heavily on his shoulders. As he dressed, he couldn't help but wonder what he had truly gotten himself into. Was this arrangement really as simple as Eleanor had made it seem? He had agreed to marry her in exchange for financial security, but deep down, Mark knew that things were rarely ever that straightforward. The lines between business and personal were beginning to blur, and he wasn't sure how he felt about it. By the time he made his way downstairs, Eleanor was already waiting for him in the kitchen, dressed in a sharp business suit. There was no sign of the woman he had spoken to the night before, the one who had opened up about her loneliness. Today, she was all business again, focused, commanding, and entirely composed. Mark nodded, feeling slightly out of his depth. He had agreed to the terms of their arrangement, but now that he was here, it felt like he was stepping into a world that was not his own. Mark glanced at the schedule. The events seemed endless: meetings, galas, charity functions. His role in this arrangement was becoming clear. He would be Eleanor's arm candy, a convenient husband to show off at high-profile events. Mark sat in silence for a moment, absorbing her words. It was true. He had chosen this. He needed this. But the deeper he got into the arrangement, the more he wondered if he had made the right decision. Eleanor continued, her voice taking on a more personal tone. I'm not expecting you to love me, Mark. That was never the point. But you need to start acting like my husband, at least in public. You need to play the role. She paused, studying him. And if you can do that, we both get what we want. Mark felt the weight of her words, the pressure building. He had to play the part. He had no choice. He had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. Later that day, Mark found himself standing by Eleanor's side at the charity gala. The lights were dazzling, and the room was filled with the city's elite, all mingling and laughing like they were part of some exclusive club. As Eleanor spoke with various guests, Mark stood beside her, smiling politely, but feeling utterly out of place. He had never been in a setting like this before. The wealth, the power, it was all so foreign to him. At one point, a reporter approached them, asking for a picture of the happy couple. Mark smiled, feeling the pressure to look convincing. He placed his hand on Eleanor's back, trying to make it look natural, even though the gesture felt strange. As the night wore on, Mark found himself increasingly uncomfortable. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was living someone else's life, a life that wasn't his. He had agreed to this marriage for financial reasons, but he was beginning to question what it was costing him emotionally. By the time the gala ended, Mark was exhausted. He had played his part well, but the whole experience had left him drained. Eleanor seemed unfazed, as usual. She was always in control, always the picture of elegance and poise. As they left the event and made their way to the car, Mark couldn't help but feel conflicted. He had married Eleanor to escape his struggles, but now he was beginning to wonder if the price of that escape was too high. He turned to her as they drove off into the night. This isn't what I expected, he said quietly. Mark nodded, his mind racing with questions. He had agreed to this new life, but he wasn't sure if he could keep up the act. And what happened if he couldn't? Stay tuned for the next part of the story, where Mark faces a decision that could change everything. The following week, Mark began to settle into his new life with Eleanor, though it still felt more like a performance than reality. He followed her from event to event, each one more extravagant than the last. As the days passed, his sense of unease grew. He was playing the role of a husband, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. There was no warmth between him and Eleanor, no real connection, just the cold, calculated nature of their arrangement. Despite the discomfort, Mark continued to fulfill his duties. They attended a gala for a children's charity one evening, where Eleanor was the guest of honor. Mark stood beside her, his role as her husband still, feeling like a mask he couldn't quite pull off. He tried to smile for the cameras, to look as if they were the perfect couple, but deep down, he was beginning to question what he had gotten himself into. Later that evening, as they sat at a table in the crowded ballroom, Eleanor turned to him. "You're doing well," she said, her tone neutral, almost approving. "But I can tell you're still not fully committed to this. You need to start acting like my husband, Mark. Not just for the public, but for yourself." She paused, studying him carefully. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I don't know if I can ever be that person," he admitted quietly. "I didn't sign up for a life of pretending. This is all too much." His voice trailed off as he looked around the room. The glittering lights, the laughter, the way everyone seemed to have a role to play, it all felt fake. Eleanor's expression softened, though her gaze remained sharp. "You're not pretending, Mark," she said slowly. "This is your life now. We both knew what we were getting into. If you want to make it work, you have to commit. Not just for the sake of appearances, but for your own future. I'm offering you a chance to change your life. You need to stop fighting it. She reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. Mark stared at her hand, unsure of what to say. He had agreed to this, yes. But now that he was in it, he couldn't help but feel trapped. Was this really the life he wanted? Was it worth the price? That night, Mark lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling. Eleanor's words echoed in his mind. He knew she was right. He had made a choice, and now he had to live with it. But as the silence of the mansion surrounded him, he couldn't help but wonder if there was more to life than this cold, calculated existence. Could he ever find something real in a marriage that had started as nothing more than a business deal? The next morning, Mark woke up early, unable to sleep any longer. He needed some air. He slipped out of the house and took a walk through the sprawling gardens behind the estate. The morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the landscape. As he walked, he tried to clear his mind, but the questions kept coming. Could he really commit to this life? Could he ever love Eleanor? Or was this just another way for him to escape his problems, without ever truly facing them? As he walked, lost in thought, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Eleanor, dressed in a simple but elegant outfit, walking toward him. She had a soft smile on her face, but there was something different in her eyes. For the first time, she didn't look like the cold, distant woman he had been living with for the past few weeks. There was a vulnerability to her that he hadn't seen before. Mark felt a shift in his chest as he looked at her. For the first time, he saw her not just as the businesswoman offering him a lifeline, but as a person who was just as lonely and uncertain as he was. Maybe she wasn't the perfect partner he had imagined, but maybe she was the only one who truly understood what it felt like to be trapped in a life they hadn't chosen. He didn't know what to say. His emotions were a whirlwind, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to trust her. But there was something in her words, something that made him wonder if this arrangement could be more than just a contract. Could they really find a way to make this work? Could he let go of his pride and truly commit to this strange new life they had built together? As the morning sun continued to rise, Mark and Eleanor stood together, the weight of the unspoken between them lingering in the air. And for the first time since their marriage began, Mark felt a small flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, this arrangement could lead to something more. Stay tuned for the next part of the story, where Mark and Eleanor face a challenge that will test their commitment to each other and force them to confront their true feelings. The next few days were filled with a strange new routine for Mark. He spent most of his time at Eleanor's estate, attending meetings, business events, and dinners. He was still playing the part of the husband, but something had shifted. It wasn't just the public appearances anymore. Eleanor's words had gotten under his skin. She wanted him to trust her, to commit fully to the arrangement, and he was beginning to see her not just as a business partner, but as a woman with her own desires, fears, and loneliness. One evening, after a long day filled with charity events and networking, Mark found himself in Eleanor's office. He had been reviewing some documents when Eleanor walked in, a glass of wine in hand. She smiled softly at him, her usual composed demeanor showing a hint of weariness. Her words hung in the air, and Mark felt the tension in his chest loosen a little. She was right. Despite the unusual nature of their marriage, they were both doing what they could to navigate a complicated situation. He had agreed to this because he needed it, but the more time he spent with her, the more he realized that this wasn't just about survival anymore. But there was still the problem of his feelings. He couldn't deny the way he felt when he was with her, the moments when their connection felt real. But then the next minute, he would remind himself that this was all a deal. There were no promises of love, no guarantee that this could work beyond the terms of their agreement. He stood up, pacing around the room, trying to collect his thoughts. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," he confessed, his voice tinged with frustration. "I feel like I'm living a lie. And no matter how much I try to convince myself that this is the right choice, I'm just not sure I'm capable of pretending anymore." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then stood up and walked over to him. She placed a gentle hand on his arm, a gesture that, for once, felt genuine. "Mark, I'm not asking you to pretend. I just want you to be here, with me. I know that this is difficult, but we can make it work. We have to give it time. This doesn't have to be a lie if we don't treat it like one." Mark looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he saw something other than the powerful, businesswoman persona she had kept up for so long. There was a softness there, a sincerity that made him question his doubts. They stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. Mark felt his resolve wavering. He had made so many decisions based on survival, but this was different. For the first time, he wondered if he could let go of the fear and let this arrangement turn into something more. The next day, Mark had a conversation with Eleanor that would change the course of their relationship. It wasn't about paperwork or business anymore. It was about their future, what it could look like, and what they could both give up to make this work. They both agreed that they would stop pretending and face the reality of their situation. Mark wasn't sure what would come next, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe he didn't have to choose between survival and happiness. Maybe there was a way to make them both fit together. Stay tuned for the next chapter, where Mark and Eleanor take a leap of faith in their relationship, but not without facing the consequences of their choices. The following week, Mark and Eleanor's routine began to shift. There was still the facade of their business marriage, but now, there was a new undercurrent of something more real between them. Mark had taken her words to heart, and for the first time since their agreement began, he was allowing himself to feel. It wasn't easy. Old habits, old fears, still held him back, but he was starting to see the cracks in the armor he had built around himself. They spent more time together, not just at events, but also in quiet moments at the estate. Eleanor had started to open up more, sharing pieces of her life, her past. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Mark to sense that there was more to her than the powerful businesswoman persona she projected to the world. And slowly, Mark began to see her as more than just the woman who had saved him from his financial ruin. One evening, after a particularly long day at a business meeting, Eleanor invited Mark to join her in the garden. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the perfectly manicured lawn. The air was cool, and the quiet hum of nature filled the space as they walked side by side, the distance between them closing just a little more with every step. Mark paused, thinking about her question. His life before Eleanor had been hard, filled with stress and uncertainty, but it had also been simpler in some ways. He had worked hard for everything, but at least he had known what to expect. Eleanor turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. There was a moment of silence before she spoke again. Mark felt a tightness in his chest as she spoke, the words resonating deep inside him. He had never expected Eleanor to open up like this, and he hadn't realized how much he had been holding back himself. The barriers they both had built up were starting to break down, and he could feel the weight of that shift between them. Eleanor smiled softly, and for the first time, Mark saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. It was fleeting, but it was there. Mark took a deep breath, feeling the gravity of her words. For the first time, he wasn't just playing a role. He was here, in this moment, with her, for something more than just survival. He had started to see the possibility of a future where they didn't just act the part of husband and wife, but where they could actually become a team. The next few days were different. Mark and Eleanor started to spend time in a way they hadn't before, doing simple things together that didn't involve a camera or an audience. They had dinner without the pretense of being a couple for show, shared stories from their childhoods, and even laughed at silly things that no one else would understand. But despite the new closeness they were developing, Mark knew that the real test of their connection would come soon. There were still things unsaid, emotions that neither of them had fully acknowledged yet. And in the back of his mind, Mark wondered if he could ever truly let go of the past, or if Eleanor would be able to see him as more than just a solution to her loneliness. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden, Mark decided to voice his concerns. "Eleanor, I'm still not sure where we go from here. You've been kind, and I see the effort you're making, but I can't help but wonder if I'm still just your solution. Your way out of something, instead of a real partner." He looked down, unsure if he had said too much. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, and then she reached for his hand. Her touch was warm, steady. Mark looked at her, feeling something shift inside him. Maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. Maybe they could stop pretending and finally start building something real. Stay tuned for the next part of the story, where Mark and Eleanor take their first real step into an uncertain future together. The days that followed Mark and Eleanor's heart-to-heart conversation were filled with a sense of uncertainty, yet there was an undeniable shift in their dynamic. Mark began to embrace the idea that this marriage, however it had started, could become something real. Slowly, He was starting to let go of his old fears, and Eleanor, too, seemed more open, less guarded. They spent more time together, talking not just about their responsibilities, but about their hopes and the future. One evening, as they sat in Eleanor's study, reviewing plans for an upcoming charity event, Mark looked up from the papers and met her gaze. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice soft, but certain. "I've spent so much time focusing on what I've lost, my independence, my freedom, and I didn't really think about what I could gain, what we could build together." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I'm still not sure about all of this, but I'm willing to try. I want to be here, not just for the deal, but because I'm starting to see the value in what we're doing." Eleanor put down the documents, her eyes softening as she listened. "I never expected this to be easy, Mark. But hearing you say that, it means more to me than you know. I've spent so many years working for this empire, trying to fill the emptiness with power and success, but I've realized it's never been enough. Not without someone to share it with. Not without someone who truly understands." She leaned back in her chair, her voice quiet, but full of emotion. Mark nodded, feeling a shift in his chest as he listened to her. Eleanor had always been the one in control, the one with the answers, but now she seemed vulnerable, as if she were opening up to the possibility of something deeper. And for the first time, Mark truly saw her, not just as the powerful businesswoman he had initially believed her to be, but as someone who had fought for everything she had, and in the process, had become lonely and disconnected from the very things that mattered most. The conversation left Mark with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear: this wasn't just a business arrangement anymore. Their relationship was evolving into something that neither of them had expected, but both of them were beginning to realize might hold real potential. The following week, Mark and Eleanor attended a high-profile gala together, and for the first time, Mark wasn't just playing the role of her husband. He was present, engaged, and for once, he didn't feel like he was pretending. As they mingled with guests, their conversations flowed more easily. Eleanor smiled at him in a way that was warm and genuine, and Mark found himself smiling back, despite the pressure of the event. At one point during the evening, Eleanor leaned in close to Mark, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "I never thought I'd feel like this again," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "But being with you tonight, it feels real." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. And Mark, for the first time since they had entered this arrangement, believed her. The night wore on, and Mark found himself thinking more about what Eleanor had said. For so long, he had kept himself closed off, focused solely on the practical aspects of his life. But now, as he looked at her, he saw more than just the powerful woman who had saved him from his financial troubles. He saw someone who was trying to build something meaningful, someone who had also been searching for a connection. As the evening came to a close, Eleanor took Mark's hand as they walked to the car, her touch soft but assured. Mark realized that their journey was only just beginning. They were no longer just playing roles for the world to see. They were beginning to create something real, something that, if they were both brave enough to face the challenges ahead, could grow into something lasting. Stay tuned for the next part of the story, where Mark and Eleanor are forced to confront their feelings for each other and decide if they can truly make this partnership work, both in the public eye and in their private lives. In the days that followed the gala, Mark and Eleanor continued to grow closer, though the shift in their dynamic wasn't without its challenges. Mark had started to let down his guard, and for the first time, he wasn't just living in the moment for the sake of survival. He was beginning to allow himself to care. But the deeper they went into this arrangement, the more complicated things became. One evening, as they sat in the drawing room of Eleanor's estate, the soft glow of the fire casting shadows on the walls, Mark found himself caught between two conflicting emotions. On one hand, he was starting to feel something real for Eleanor, something beyond the boundaries of their business agreement. But on the other hand, he was still unsure if he could fully commit to a life that had begun as a transaction. Eleanor looked at him thoughtfully, her expression softening. "I've never wanted just a contract, Mark," she said quietly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I wanted more too. But it's hard to let yourself believe that after everything. We've both been through so much, built walls around ourselves. But I think we're both starting to see what could be possible if we stop hiding behind them." She took a deep breath, the weight of the moment hanging between them. Mark sat back in his chair, his heart racing as he processed her words. He had started to let himself believe that this wasn't just a business arrangement, but the idea of truly letting go of the past, of opening himself up to Eleanor, still felt like a risk he wasn't sure he was ready to take. Eleanor's gaze never wavered. "I know," she said softly. "I don't expect you to just give all of yourself to me overnight. But I think we've already taken the first step by being honest with each other. And that's something we both need to keep working on. We're both scared, Mark. But we're not alone in this anymore." She smiled gently, a quiet understanding passing between them. Despite the unspoken bond they were beginning to form, there was still a part of Mark that felt trapped by the role he had been playing for so long. The line between what was real and what was fake was beginning to blur, and he wasn't sure how to navigate it. But as Eleanor spoke, he felt a shift in himself, a desire to try, to see where this could really go. The following week, they faced another challenge, one that would test the strength of their growing connection. At a high-profile business dinner, Mark and Eleanor were forced to confront their feelings in front of others. As they walked into the grand hall, the usual tension hung in the air. The cameras were flashing, the guests were whispering, and the eyes of the business world were on them. As they posed for photos, Mark felt Eleanor's hand gently rest on his arm. This time, the touch didn't feel forced, didn't feel like part of a show. It felt real. He looked at her, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. There were no cameras, no expectations, just the two of them, standing together. After the dinner, as they walked back to the car, Eleanor broke the silence. "You did well tonight," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "I know this isn't easy, Mark, but you're starting to let me in, and that means more to me than I can say." She stopped walking for a moment and turned to face him. "I know this has been hard. I know we're still figuring things out, but I believe in what we're building here." Mark looked at her, his heart full of emotions he couldn't fully express. The tension that had plagued him for weeks had finally started to ease. He was no longer just acting a part, no longer pretending to be something he wasn't. This was real, and for the first time, he could see the possibility of something more. He took a deep breath, finally allowing himself to smile. "I believe in it too," he said softly, "and I'm ready to see where it takes us." Stay tuned for the next part of the story, where Mark and Eleanor face the future together, uncertain but hopeful, as they take their next steps in building something real. As the weeks passed, Mark and Eleanor continued to build something that neither of them had anticipated, something real. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. They spent more time together, talking about everything and nothing. They shared laughs, quiet moments, and a growing sense of trust that neither had expected to find. The distance that had once defined their relationship was slowly disappearing, replaced by a bond neither of them could deny. One evening, as they sat in the living room after dinner, Eleanor turned to Mark, her expression soft, her eyes filled with an emotion he hadn't seen before, vulnerability. "Mark," she said quietly, her voice steady but full of meaning, "I want you to know that this partnership, it means more to me than I ever thought it would." She paused, searching for the right words. "I didn't expect to find someone who could understand me this way, someone who would challenge me, but also stand by me. I never expected to feel like I do now." Mark looked at her, his heart racing. He had always been guarded, always afraid to let anyone in. But with Eleanor, he had done the one thing he never thought he could. He had opened himself up. And now, sitting beside her, he realized just how much he had come to care for her. "I didn't expect this either," he said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. "I came into this marriage thinking it was just a way out, a deal. But now I see that it's so much more. You've made me feel something I didn't even know I was missing." The weight of his words hung between them for a moment, and Eleanor's eyes softened. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" she said with a small, knowing smile. "From two people who didn't trust each other, to this. And I think, for the first time, we're really starting to understand each other." Mark nodded, feeling the truth of her words. They had come a long way, and though they hadn't gotten everything right, they had both tried. They had faced their fears, confronted their insecurities, and allowed themselves to become something more than just partners in a business arrangement. They had become something more real, something grounded in mutual respect and understanding. As the evening wore on, Mark and Eleanor found themselves sitting closer, their hands brushing against each other as they spoke. It was a small gesture, but it meant more than either of them could put into words. There was no longer a need to pretend, no longer a need to hide behind the facade of a marriage for convenience. They had become partners in the truest sense of the word, not just in business, but in life. Later that week, Mark and Eleanor attended a charity gala together. The event was grand, filled with the city's elite, but this time, it felt different. As they entered the room, Mark didn't feel like he was just playing a part. He was there as Eleanor's equal, not just a husband in name, but someone who had earned his place by her side. Their connection, once tentative, now felt solid, unshakable. As they posed for pictures together, their hands naturally found each other's, and the smile that appeared on Mark's face wasn't for show, it was real. As the night came to a close, they stood on the balcony, overlooking the city lights. Mark turned to Eleanor, his voice quiet but filled with conviction. "You were right," he said, his gaze steady. This is real. And I'm here. For you, for us." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes shining. "I knew you'd get there, Mark. I knew you could see what we were building." Mark took a deep breath, finally feeling like he had found his place, not just in Eleanor's life, but in his own. He had come to this arrangement with so much uncertainty, but now, standing here with her, he knew that this wasn't just a contract anymore. It was a future, one they would build together. Stay tuned for the next chapter of their story, where they face new challenges, but this time, they know they are stronger together.